January 1945, an American POW assigned to clean German fighter planes at a Luftwaffe airfield makes a split-second decision that will either kill him or make history. He's going to steal one and fly it across enemy lines to freedom. For 8 months, the Nazis thought putting a captured pilot near operational aircraft was safe because escape seemed impossible. But they made one fatal miscalculation. How does a man with nothing but his flight training and sheer audacity hijack one of Germany's fastest warplanes in broad daylight and turn the enemy's greatest weapon into his ticket home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. January 1945. The war in Europe had been grinding on for 5 long years. Nazi Germany still controlled huge pieces of land from the beaches of France all the way to the frozen fields deep inside Russia. German planes, thousands of them, still filled the skies even though many had been shot down. The Luftwaffe, as the German Air Force was called, was getting weaker every day, but it still had fight left in it. Across all the lands Germany controlled, prison camps held captured soldiers from America, Britain, and other Allied countries. These camps were supposed to follow rules from something called the Geneva Convention, which said prisoners had to be treated humanely. But as Germany started losing the war, food got scarce and guards got meaner. The camps became harder places to survive. In 1945, the world didn't have the things we have today. No satellites watching from space, no cell phones. Radio communication was basic and scratchy. If you escaped from a prison camp, you were truly on your own. There were no GPS devices to guide you home, no way to call for help. The German military still ran with iron discipline, every soldier doing exactly what he was told, every rule followed to the letter. But cracks were starting to show. Germany was running out of gasoline, out of food, out of hope. Those cracks would become important later, though nobody knew it yet. Second Lieutenant William Overstreet was 24 years old. Everyone called him Bill. He came from Virginia, from farm country where tobacco grew in long green rows under the summer sun. Before the war, Bill had learned to fly crop-dusting planes over those fields, swooping low to spray chemicals on the crops. He loved being in the air more than anything. When the war started, he joined up and became a fighter pilot, flying P-51 Mustangs. Those were beautiful planes, fast and deadly, with their silver bodies and the roar of their Rolls-Royce engines. Bill was good at flying. He understood how planes worked because he'd been tinkering with engines since he was a kid. He was studying to be an engineer before the war interrupted everything. Then, one day in early 1944, Bill's luck ran out. He was flying a mission over occupied France when German fighters jumped him. Bullets punched through his Mustang's wing. Black smoke poured from the engine. The controls went slack in his hands. He had maybe 10 seconds to decide: stay with the plane and die, or bail out and become a prisoner. He pulled the canopy release, unbuckled, and threw himself into the screaming wind. The parachute opened with a violent jerk. He floated down into enemy territory, knowing his war had just taken a terrible turn. German soldiers were waiting when he landed. They searched him, took his watch and his wedding ring, and loaded him onto a truck. He'd been a prisoner of war for 8 months now. Stalag Luft III was Bill's home, though calling it a home was a cruel joke. The camp sat in Silesia, Poland, in flat country where winter wind cut through your clothes like a knife. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the compound, all of them identical, all of them miserable. Double fences of barbed wire surrounded everything, the wires twisted and sharp and impossible to climb. Guard towers rose at the corners, machine guns pointed inward. At night, searchlights swept back and forth, turning the darkness into a stage where any movement meant death. Bill slept on a wooden bunk so hard it might as well have been the floor. The mattress was stuffed with wood shavings that poked through the thin fabric. Lice lived in the seams of the blankets. You could feel them crawling on your skin at night, biting, sucking blood. The itching never stopped. Food at Stalag Luft III was barely enough to keep a man alive. Breakfast was a cup of ersatz coffee, which wasn't real coffee at all, but roasted acorns ground into brown powder. It tasted like dirt. Lunch was watery soup with maybe a few bits of turnip or potato floating in it. Dinner was a slice of black bread so dense and heavy you could use it as a weapon. The bread was 5 inches long, 3 inches wide, and made from sawdust mixed with a little bit of rye flour. Bill's stomach ached constantly. He lost 20 pounds in the first 2 months. His uniform hung on him like he was a scarecrow. The days at the camp followed the same pattern, over and over, until they blurred together into one long gray nightmare. Every morning at dawn, the guards blew whistles and shouted. All the prisoners had to line up outside for roll call, standing in rows while German officers counted them. This took an hour, sometimes 2, no matter if it was raining or snowing or so cold your fingers went numb. After roll call, there was nothing to do. Some men walked circles around the exercise yard, a bare dirt rectangle worn smooth by thousands of boots. Some played cards with decks so worn the numbers had faded away. Some just sat on their bunks and stared at the wall, their eyes empty. But underneath the boredom, something else was happening. The prisoners were planning. Secret committees met in corners of barracks. Men were digging tunnels, inch by inch, hiding the dirt in their pockets and scattering it around the yard. Others forged identity papers, turning German newspapers into fake documents. Tailors unpicked uniforms and sewed them back together to look like civilian clothes. Everyone was trying to find a way out. Bill joined the planning sessions. He studied maps other prisoners had drawn from memory. He memorized German phrases. But deep down, he wondered if any escape plan could work. The camp was in the middle of nowhere. Even if you got past the fences, you'd have to walk hundreds of miles through enemy territory to reach Allied lines. You'd need food, civilian clothes, perfect German, and incredible luck. Most men who escaped were caught within 2 days and thrown into solitary confinement. Some were shot. Then everything changed. It was a freezing morning in January when the guards came to Bill's barracks and read off a list of names. Bill's name was on it. 12 prisoners total. They were told to gather their few belongings immediately. No explanation. The guards wouldn't answer questions. Fear rose in Bill's chest. Transfers were unpredictable and often bad. Were they being moved to a worse camp? Were they being taken somewhere to be executed? In the final months of the war, rumors swirled about SS troops taking over camps and murdering prisoners to leave no witnesses. They loaded Bill and the others onto the back of a canvas-covered truck. The engine coughed to life, and they rolled out through the main gate. Bill sat on a wooden bench, watching through gaps in the canvas as the camp disappeared behind them. The truck drove for hours on bumpy roads. Through the slats, Bill caught glimpses of the German countryside. Villages with houses that had no roofs, walls blown apart by bombs. Refugees walking along the roads, carrying everything they owned in bundles on their backs. Germany was dying. Anyone could see that, but it was dying hard and taking everyone down with it. When the truck finally stopped, the guards ordered them out. Bill jumped down and looked around. His breath caught in his throat. They weren't at another prison camp. They were standing at the edge of an airfield, a real Luftwaffe airfield with operational aircraft. Bill's pilot eyes took it all in instantly. Rows of fighter planes lined up on the tarmac. Bombers parked near hangars. Fuel trucks moving between the aircraft. Ground crews in gray uniforms working on engines. The smell of aviation fuel hung in the cold air, sharp and familiar. It was a smell Bill hadn't experienced in 8 months, and it hit him like a drug. This was Frankfurt Eschborn, though Bill didn't know the name yet. A German officer explained in broken English that they would be working here as laborers, performing maintenance on aircraft. The officer's face was hard and tired. He was maybe 40 years old, with scars on his neck. He told them the rules. Obey all orders. Stay in their assigned areas. Any attempt to escape would result in immediate execution. Then the guards marched them to a small barracks at the far end of the field. It was barely warmer inside than outside, but at least the wind stopped cutting through their clothes. That night, lying on another hard bunk in another strange place, Bill couldn't sleep. His mind was racing. They put us next to planes, he kept thinking. Operational planes. Planes with fuel in them. Planes that can fly. It seemed impossible, insane even. Why would the Germans put captured pilots near aircraft? But then Bill understood. The Germans were desperate. They needed every available hand for labor. And they thought it didn't matter because even if a prisoner could reach a plane, he'd never get it started, never get it off the ground before guards shot him dead. The arrogance of it was stunning. They believed escape from an airfield was so impossible they didn't even need to worry about it. Bill stared at the dark ceiling. For the first time in 8 months, something stirred inside him that he'd thought was dead. It wasn't quite hope. It was something harder and sharper. It was possibility. The first morning at Frankfurt-Eschborn Airfield, Bill woke to the sound of aircraft engines warming up. The deep rumble shook the wooden walls of the barracks. He dressed quickly in the cold and lined up with the other prisoners for roll call. A Luftwaffe sergeant assigned them their jobs for the day. Bill's assignment made his heart skip. He would clean the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf WWII fighter. The sergeant handed him a bucket of soapy water and a rag, then pointed to a gray-green aircraft sitting 30 yards away on the tarmac. Bill walked toward the plane trying to look casual, like this was just another boring work detail. But inside, his pulse was racing. The WWII was a beautiful machine, deadly and compact. Its radial engine looked like a giant fan with 9 cylinders arranged in a circle. The cockpit sat high off the ground. Bill climbed the metal ladder attached to the fuselage and opened the canopy. The smell hit him immediately. Leather, oil, metal, and something else he couldn't name. It was the smell of a working warplane. He settled into the seat and pretended to wipe down the instruments. But what he was really doing was memorizing everything. The throttle sat on the left side. The control stick rose from the floor between his legs. The instrument panel had gauges marked in German, but the layout was similar to American planes. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, fuel gauge, engine temperature. His hands moved over the controls without thinking, muscle memory from hundreds of hours in P-51 cockpits taking over. A pilot's training goes deep, into the bones and nerves. You don't forget how to fly, any more than you forget how to breathe. The days began to form a pattern. Every morning, Bill and the other prisoners were assigned to different aircraft. Sometimes he cleaned, sometimes he handed tools to German mechanics. The work was cold and boring, but Bill's mind was always active, always watching. He noticed things. The German ground crews looked exhausted. Many were teenagers, boys really, barely old enough to shave. Others were older men with bandages covering wounds from the Eastern Front. These weren't the crack troops of 1940 who'd swept across Europe. These were the leftovers, the last desperate scraping of Germany's manpower barrel. They moved slowly, their eyes dull with fatigue and hopelessness. Fuel was scarce. Bill watched mechanics drain gasoline from damaged planes to fill operational ones. Tools were in short supply too. He saw 2 mechanics fighting over a single wrench. Parts were cannibalized from wrecked aircraft scattered around the field like the bones of metal dinosaurs. Yet, despite all the shortages, the airfield still functioned with German efficiency. Aircraft were lined up in precise rows. Maintenance schedules were posted on bulletin boards. Every tool had its proper place in the repair kits. The contrast was striking. An empire falling apart, but still keeping everything organized until the very end. On his 3rd day, Bill was assigned to work alongside a young German mechanic named Klaus. Klaus was 19, thin as a rail, with blonde hands and nervous hands. He spoke a little English, learned from a schoolteacher before the war. During a break, Klaus shared his ersatz coffee with Bill. They sat on wooden crates near a hangar, sipping the bitter acorn water. Klaus pulled a photograph from his wallet. It showed a woman and two small children standing in front of a brick building. "My mother and sisters," Klaus said, his voice soft. "In Hamburg, British bombers destroyed their house last year. They live in a church basement now." He looked at Bill with eyes that held no anger, only sadness and confusion. "Why do you burn our cities?" he asked. "We are just people." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Bill didn't know how to answer. He thought about explaining strategic bombing, about breaking Germany's will to fight, about the factories and rail yards that were the real targets. But looking at Klaus, holding that photograph of his homeless family, all the military strategy seemed hollow. Bill had dropped bombs on German cities himself. He'd watched them fall away from his Mustang, tumbling down towards streets and buildings far below. He'd never thought much about who lived there. Now he was sitting next to someone whose family lived under those bombs. The war suddenly felt more complicated than good guys versus bad guys. It felt like a machine that ground up everyone, German and American alike, and left nothing but grief behind. But Bill couldn't let sympathy cloud his thinking. These people were still his enemies, still his captors. Klaus might be a decent kid, but he wore a swastika on his uniform. The system he served had started this war, had murdered millions, had to be stopped. Feeling sorry for individual Germans didn't change that. Bill accepted the coffee and thanked Klaus in his broken German. Then he went back to work. By the fourth week, Bill had the airfield mapped in his mind like a blueprint. He knew where every plane was parked. He knew the guard rotation schedule because he'd watched the towers change shifts at the same times every day. 8 in the morning, 4 in the afternoon, midnight. He knew that fuel trucks made their rounds at dawn, filling aircraft for the day's missions. He knew which mechanics were careful and which ones were sloppy. He noticed that every Tuesday afternoon, a big transport plane arrived carrying supplies. The Junkers Ju-52 had 3 engines and a corrugated metal skin that looked like a flying barn. It usually sat unguarded for 2 or 3 hours while crews unloaded cargo. Bill filed all this information away, not sure yet what he'd do with it, but knowing that information was power. One evening, Bill was sweeping out a crew room when he heard German officers talking in the next room. He froze and listened. His German wasn't good, but he caught enough words to understand. They were talking about a new reconnaissance plane arriving soon. One officer, drunk on schnapps, laughed and said something about it being the fastest single-seat aircraft in the Luftwaffe. Even an American couldn't catch it, the man boasted. The other officers laughed. Bill kept sweeping, his face blank, but his mind was spinning. A fast plane, single-seat, which meant no co-pilot, no extra crew. If such a plane arrived, and he could somehow reach it, if the timing was right, if 1,000 things went perfectly, maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this place. The seed of an impossible plan began to grow in his mind. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was preparing. He was thinking like a pilot again, calculating angles and distances and fuel loads. He was thinking about flying. February 1945 arrived with bitter cold and chaos. The airfield at Frankfurt-Eschborn felt like it was coming apart at the seams. Allied bombers hit nearby targets almost every day. Bill could hear the explosions in the distance, feel the ground shake beneath his feet. At night, the sky glowed orange from fires in the city. Rumors spread among the German crews like wildfire. The Russians were advancing from the east, getting closer every day. Some soldiers whispered about surrender. Others talked about fighting to the last man. The officers barked orders louder than before, trying to keep control, but everyone could feel the discipline cracking like ice on a warming pond. The guard towers still had machine guns pointed at the prisoners, but Bill noticed the guards weren't as alert anymore. They huddled in their towers, smoking cigarettes, looking scared. Some were old men who should have been sitting by fireplaces, not holding rifles. The fuel situation got worse. Missions were canceled because there wasn't enough gasoline. Pilots sat in ready rooms with nothing to do, staring at walls, waiting for orders that never came. The whole airfield felt like a dying animal, still dangerous but weakened, confused, running on instinct alone. Then one morning in the second week of February, Bill saw it. He was walking across the tarmac carrying a toolbox when movement caught his eye. Ground crews were pushing a fighter plane out of a hangar. But this wasn't just any fighter. Bill's breath stopped in his throat. It was a Focke-Wulf FW-190 D9, called a Dora by the pilots who flew it. This was the plane the drunk officer had bragged about weeks earlier. Bill had seen pictures of Doras in intelligence briefings back when he was still flying missions. It was Germany's answer to high-altitude American bombers, stretched longer than regular FW-190s with an inline engine instead of a radial. It was faster than almost anything in the sky. And right now, it sat alone near the maintenance hangar, its long nose pointing toward the runway like it was eager to fly. Bill forced himself to keep walking, to not stare, to act like he didn't care. But his heart hammered against his ribs. He delivered the toolbox to a mechanic working on a different plane, then found a reason to sweep the area near the Dora. He moved closer, pushing his broom across the concrete, stealing glances at the aircraft. The fuel cap was sealed tight, which meant the tanks were full. The guns were loaded, he could tell by the way the ammunition bay doors sat flush. This plane was ready for a mission. A pilot in a leather jacket climbed into the cockpit, started the engine. The BMW 801 roared to life, that beautiful, terrible sound of 1,000 horsepower waking up. Then a staff car screeched to a halt next to the plane. An officer jumped out and shouted something at the pilot. The pilot shut down the engine, climbed out, and followed the officer toward the operations building. They were having an argument, the pilot gesturing angrily. Some kind of last-minute briefing or orders changed. The Dora sat there, engine warm, fueled, armed, alone. No guards nearby. The ground crews had moved on to other tasks. Bill stood 50 feet away, holding a broom, looking at freedom. His hands started shaking. This was it. Not a plan carefully built over weeks. Not a tunnel dug inch by inch. This was a moment born from pure chance, a crack in reality that might never open again. If he walked away now, went back to the barracks, played it safe, he might survive the war. The Allies were winning. Germany would collapse soon. He could wait it out, go home in a few months when peace came. That was the smart choice, the safe choice. But something had changed inside Bill during these 8 months. Captivity had burned away the parts of him that could accept being caged. He'd spent 240 days being told where to stand, when to eat, when to sleep. He'd watched good men turn into hollow shells, their spirits broken by the grinding routine of imprisonment. He'd felt himself starting to slip into that same darkness, felt hope dying like a candle running out of wax. And then they'd brought him here, to this airfield, surrounded him with wings and engines and sky. They'd reminded him what he was, not a prisoner, not a number, a pilot. And pilots fly. Bill looked around. The nearest guard tower was 100 yards away. The guard was facing the other direction, watching the perimeter fence. Other guards were clustered near the main gate, drinking coffee, not paying attention to the maintenance area. The mechanics were inside the hangar. The pilot and officer were still visible in the distance, arguing outside the operations building. Time seemed to slow down. Bill could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He thought about his wife back in Virginia, wondered if he'd ever see her again. He thought about Klaus and his homeless family, about all the young men on both sides who'd never asked for this war. He thought about the 10 seconds he'd had in the air over France when his Mustang was dying, that choice between staying with the plane or jumping. He'd jumped then. He'd survived. Now here was another choice, another 10 seconds that would decide everything. Bill dropped the broom. He started walking toward the door, not fast, not slow, just steady, like he had every right to be there. His legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. He grabbed a rag from his pocket, made it look like he was going to wipe down the canopy. Just another prisoner doing his job, nothing to see. He reached the ladder, climbed up. The cockpit smelled like fuel and leather and German cigarettes. He slid into the seat. The controls were exactly where he'd memorized them from cleaning other FW-190s. His hands moved without thinking, flipping switches, checking gauges. The instrument panel was in German, but he didn't need to read the words. He knew what each gauge measured by its position and shape. He primed the engine. His thumb found the starter button. He pressed it. The BMW 801 coughed, then roared. The whole aircraft vibrated with power. Shouts erupted from the hangar. Bill looked up and saw mechanics running toward him, waving their arms. A guard in the nearest tower swung his machine gun around. Bill released the brakes and shoved the throttle forward. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 Dora leaped forward like a greyhound released from a cage. Bill felt the acceleration press him back into the seat. The engine's roar filled the cockpit, filled his chest, filled every part of him with sound and fury. He'd forgotten how alive flying felt, how complete. Behind him, guards were running. He could see them in his peripheral vision, tiny figures with rifles. Muzzle flashes sparkled from the guard tower. Bullets hit the tarmac near the plane's wheels, sending up little spurts of concrete dust. One round pinged off the armored plate behind his seat. Bill's training took over, his body remembering what his mind had almost forgotten. He kept the throttle pushed all the way forward, keeping the tail down as the plane accelerated. The taxiway blurred beneath him, 50 miles per hour, 70, 90. The control stick grew lighter in his hand as air began flowing over the wings, creating lift. At 110 miles per hour, Bill pulled back gently on the stick. The nose came up. The bumping of the wheels stopped. He was airborne. The ground fell away beneath him, and suddenly he was climbing into the gray February sky, free, flying, alive in a way he hadn't been for 8 months. His throat tightened with emotion, but there was no time for feelings. More gunfire erupted from the airfield below. Tracers arced up toward him, bright lines of death stitching through the air. Bill banked hard left, then right, jinking the plane to make himself a difficult target. The Dora responded beautifully to every input, tight and precise. This was a pilot's plane, built for combat, and it handled like a dream. But Bill's problems were just beginning. He was flying a German fighter over German territory. Every anti-aircraft battery for 100 miles would shoot at him. Every German pilot in the air would try to kill him. And the fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, which meant maybe 40 minutes of flying time if he was careful. He had to reach Allied lines before the fuel ran out or before someone shot him down. Bill pointed the nose west, toward Belgium, toward freedom. He stayed low, just a few hundred feet above the ground, hoping to slip under radar coverage. The German countryside rolled beneath him. Forests and fields and villages, roads clogged with refugees, broken bridges, the scars of war everywhere. 5 minutes into the flight, black puffs of smoke appeared around the plane. Flak, anti-aircraft fire. The gunners below had spotted him and opened up. Each burst was a cluster of hot metal fragments designed to rip an aircraft apart. Bill threw the Dora into a hard diving turn, then climbed again, zigzagging across the sky. The flak followed him, always a second behind, the gunners trying to guess where he'd be next. A burst exploded close enough to rock the plane. Bill felt the shock wave, heard shrapnel rattle against the fuselage. A piece of metal punched through the canopy, missing his head by inches. Cold air shrieked into the cockpit. His eyes watered from the wind. He wiped them clear and kept flying. The minutes ticked by like hours. Bill's hands were locked on the controls, his whole body tense. Every muscle ached. Flying in combat wasn't like the movies where pilots looked relaxed and confident. It was exhausting, terrifying work that demanded total concentration every single second. One mistake and you were dead. Bill followed a river west, using it as a navigation guide. The Meuse River, he thought, though he couldn't be sure. Geography looked different from the air than it did on maps. Below him, the land was torn and cratered from bombing. Entire towns were just rubble. He saw a column of German tanks moving along a road and gave them a wide berth. No reason to draw attention. Then the engine coughed. Bill's stomach dropped. He looked at the fuel gauge. The needle was dropping faster than it should. That shrapnel must have nicked a fuel line. He was losing gasoline. Bill did quick math in his head. He had maybe 15 minutes of flight time left, 20 if he was lucky. He throttled back slightly to conserve fuel, trading speed for endurance. The engine smoothed out, but the fuel kept draining. "Come on," Bill thought, talking to the plane like it could hear him. "Just a little farther. Just get me across the lines." More flak erupted ahead, a wall of black smoke. Bill dove under it, so low now he could see individual trees, individual people looking up at him. The engine coughed again, running rough. 10 minutes of fuel left, maybe less. Then the landscape began to change. The roads below were clogged with military vehicles, but these weren't German. Bill saw the white stars on the vehicles' roofs. American forces. He'd made it to Allied territory. Relief flooded through him, but he wasn't safe yet. American anti-aircraft gunners would see a German plane and shoot first, ask questions later. Bill had to signal somehow that he wasn't the enemy. He pulled back on the stick and climbed higher, then rocked the wings back and forth. Left, right, left, right. It was an old signal, universal among pilots, meaning surrender or friendly aircraft. But the gunners below either didn't see it or didn't care. Tracers came up at him, American tracers now, just as deadly as German ones. Bill's hands moved frantically over the controls, trying to avoid the fire while also keeping the sputtering engine alive. The fuel gauge read empty. The engine was running on fumes and luck. He had maybe 2 minutes before it quit completely. Ahead, Bill saw a flat area that might work for an emergency landing. It was a farmer's field, muddy and rough, but better than crashing into buildings. He had no choice anyway. The engine gave one final cough and died. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Sudden silence filled the cockpit, except for the wind screaming through the bullet hole in the canopy. Bill was gliding now, trading altitude for distance, trying to stretch every foot of height into forward motion. He aimed for the field, dropping fast, too fast. He lowered the landing gear, but realized immediately that was a mistake. The wheels would catch in the mud and flip the plane. He pulled the gear lever back up. He'd have to belly land, slide the plane in on its fuselage. The ground rushed up. Bill pulled back on the stick, flaring the nose up to bleed off speed. The Dora's tail hit first with a tremendous bang. Then the belly scraped across the muddy field with a grinding shriek of tortured metal. Mud sprayed everywhere. The plane slewed sideways, spinning like a top. Bill was thrown against his harness so hard he saw stars. The canopy frame bent and cracked. Then, finally, the Dora stopped moving. It sat in the middle of the Belgian field, nose down in the mud, wings bent, but intact. Bill sat in the cockpit, breathing hard, unable to quite believe he was still alive. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unbuckle his harness. American soldiers appeared, running across the field with rifles raised. Bill popped the canopy, raised his hands high where they could see them. "Don't shoot," he yelled. "I'm American, US Army Air Force." The soldiers surrounded the plane, shouting at him in English to get out slowly, keep his hands up. Bill climbed out onto the wing, his legs weak, and jumped down into the mud. He stood there swaying while soldiers patted him down for weapons. An officer approached, a captain with a skeptical face. "You're American?" the captain asked. "Flying a German plane?" Bill nodded, too exhausted to explain. He reached into his flight suit and pulled out his dog tags, held them out. The captain examined them, read the name and serial number, then looked at Bill with new eyes. "Holy hell," the captain said. "Where did you come from?" The interrogation took 3 days. American intelligence officers didn't believe Bill's story at first. A POW stealing a German fighter and flying it across enemy lines? It sounded like a movie plot, too wild to be real. But his dog tags checked out. His serial number matched Army records. They verified he'd been shot down over France in 1944 and listed as a prisoner at Stalag Luft III. Slowly, piece by piece, Bill's story was confirmed. The intelligence officers became excited. The FW-190 Dora he'd captured was one of Germany's newest fighters. Engineers would take it apart, study its engine, analyze its design. It was an intelligence windfall. Bill had accidentally become a hero, though he didn't feel like one. He felt tired and confused and strangely empty. They flew him back to England, gave him new uniforms, fed him real food. He gained back some of the weight he'd lost. In April, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In August, Japan surrendered too. Bill got orders to return home. He boarded a transport ship in Southampton and crossed the Atlantic, watching the ocean slide past for 7 days. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through the morning mist, every soldier on deck cheered. Bill cheered too, but part of him felt disconnected from the celebration, like he was watching it happen to someone else. A train took him from New York to Virginia. His father met him at the station in their old Ford pickup truck. They drove home through familiar countryside, past tobacco fields Bill had flown over as a teenager. Everything looked the same, but felt different. Or maybe Bill was different and the world had stayed the same. At the farm, his mother cried and hugged him. His wife cried and kissed him. Neighbors came by to shake his hand, to hear his story. Bill told them edited versions, leaving out the parts that still gave him nightmares. One evening in autumn, Bill and his father sat on the porch watching crop dusting planes work the distant fields. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and red. His father asked the question Bill had been dreading. "What did it teach you, being a prisoner?" The old man's voice was gentle but direct. He wanted a real answer, not a pleasant lie. Bill watched the crop dusters banking and turning, their movements so peaceful compared to combat. He thought about Klaus and his bombed-out family. He thought about the desperate teenage soldiers at the airfield. He thought about the moment he'd climbed into that Dora, knowing he might die in the next 10 minutes, but choosing freedom anyway. "It taught me that systems have cracks," Bill finally said. "Even systems that seem perfect and unbeatable. The Germans ran that airfield with discipline and rules and guards, but they made one mistake. They thought putting a pilot near planes was safe because escape seemed impossible. They forgot that impossible just means nobody's done it yet." He paused, searching for the right words. "And it taught me that your enemies are still people. Klaus, the German mechanic, he wasn't evil. He was just a scared kid whose family was suffering. But knowing that didn't change the fact that I had to escape, that we had to win the war. You can have empathy for individuals while still fighting the system they serve." His father nodded slowly. "Anything else?" Bill thought about that terrible, beautiful moment when the Dora's wheels left the ground, when he'd traded certain captivity for possible death and found freedom instead. "It taught me that waiting for someone to save you is just another way of giving up. For 8 months I waited, hoping the war would end, hoping someone would liberate the camp. But freedom isn't something someone gives you. It's something you take, usually at the exact moment when taking it seems most impossible. The crop dusters finished their work and flew off toward the sunset. Bill and his father sat in comfortable silence, watching darkness settle over the Virginia hills. Years later, the FW-190 Dora that Bill had flown in would end up in a museum in Dayton, Ohio. They'd mount it carefully, preserve it, mark it with both German and American insignia. Children would stand beneath its wings and ask their parents how an American plane got German markings. And the parents would tell them the story of the man who turned his enemy's weapon into his own liberation. The pilot who refused to believe locks were real. The prisoner who chose to fly. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.